This session is called Voucher Power, Creative Ways to Maximize Your Assisted Living Occupancy. And as Ashley just described, I am a housing person. I work in affordable housing. My entire career has been in affordable housing. Of course, working at LeadingAge, I also have become a little familiar with the assisted living world. And but you'll probably tell from when I talked with you all today that my assisted living knowledge is pretty thin, but my affordable housing knowledge is much higher. And so feel free to ask me any questions about assisted living or affordable housing. And I'm sure we'll have a great conversation about this potential resource. So let's start sort of at the beginning. You all are familiar with HUD. The long name of it is the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. It is our nation's federal housing agency. It's a cabinet level agency. It's that important. But housing programs in the United States are not entitlement programs, right? So just because people need them, it doesn't mean that housing programs are available to them. HUD has about 5.1 million units it subsidizes across all of its programs. So Section 202, supportive housing for the elderly, public housing, Section 8, Section 811, which is a housing program focused on persons with disabilities. And then it has the voucher program in there as well as part of that 5.1 million units it subsidizes. And the voucher program is huge in the HUD world. And of HUD's 5.1 million assisted units, 2.6 million of them is assistance provided through the voucher program. And that number has grown over the years as we've lost, say, affordable housing, entire buildings. Those residents got vouchers. Congress has seemed more inclined to add vouchers to the subsidy assistance than other types of more project-based vouchers, which has been growing at a much slower pace. So the voucher program is very big, takes up about half, a little more than half of HUD's entire rental assistance portfolio. And at the top of this slide, my point there is that we call these vouchers lots of different things. We used to call them certificates. About 30 years ago, Congress decided and made some changes. They're all vouchers. So we don't refer to them really at all anymore as vouchers, but people call them vouchers. The official name is housing choice vouchers because they give people choice in where they live. You hear them called Section 8 vouchers because they exist in a part of the statute in Section 8, and that part of the statute. We also call them tenant-based vouchers because, again, they traditionally stick with the tenant, with the resident, with the household that's using the voucher. So we call them all sorts of different things, whatever you call them: vouchers, housing choice vouchers, Section 8 vouchers, tenant-based vouchers. People in the housing world will know exactly what you're talking about. So what's so great about a voucher, just before we even get into the assisted living connection, vouchers are a deeply income targeted program. That means that Congress and HUD require housing authorities to use the majority of their vouchers to serve extremely low income households. So households with incomes below about 30% of your area median income. And in HUD's world, that is the deepest income targeting bucket of people that a HUD programs serve. Vouchers, like most other types of HUD rental subsidies, also provide really deep rent subsidy for residents, and they do that by a household by household basis. And so if you're a voucher holder, whatever your household income is, you pay about 30% of your income for rent, and then the voucher provides the balance between the difference between what you're able to pay, what's affordable to you, and what it actually costs to rent that unit. Another issue, so we have two great things, right? One is this deep income targeting that go to the households that need it the most. The second is this deep rent subsidy, right? So your household rent is always affordable to you. And if your income goes up, your rent goes up. But when your income goes down, your rent goes down. So your housing remains stable to you. And the third thing I wanted to highlight about the voucher program is how valuable is it? Vouchers are generally valued at somewhere between 90 and 110% of fair market rent. And HUD determines and sets fair market rents on an annual basis. And then whatever the fair market rent is for your area, usually, you can look it up by city, by metropolitan statistical area, by zip code in some places. Then your local public housing authority has the ability to say, okay, that's my FMR, and then the housing authority has some leeway and can set your final value of vouchers in your area from somewhere between 90 and 110% of what HUD says the fair market rent is there. So on an annual basis, HUD adjusts the value of the voucher to try and match what private owners are expecting to get paid for rent. So those vouchers can get used and people can get housing. And so did someone say public housing authority? LeadingAge is actually described, has a lot of members. Most of them are nonprofits right across the entire aging services continuum, including a lot of affordable housing providers. And we have a couple of public housing members, but not that many. But most of our housing provider members use HUD programs, but they really do not have any interaction typically with their local public housing authority. And that's because the programs they use don't have anything to do with the housing authority. Housing authorities administer the majority of the nation's vouchers. They also administer the nation's public housing. And so, and I think there's some hesitance by some, providers of housing and other aging services to work with public housing authorities. We don't know who they are. We're not really sure what they do. We're not really sure if they're government. Are they non-government? Are they nonprofits? Are they corporate? Who are they? We don't do public housing. But let me say, you're going to want to learn a little bit more about public housing authorities if you want to learn about how to potentially tap into vouchers to use them in your assisted living communities. So again, public housing authorities, and there are a lot of them, there are around 3,400 of them across the country. Some of them are giant and some of them are really, really tiny, but most of them administer the vouchers for their geographic area. And those housing authorities on a housing authority by housing authority basis decide individually if any of their vouchers can get used in assisted living. So those decisions about using vouchers in assisted living, which of course we're going to talk more about, are made at the individual PHA basis. And here's the beauty of what we're going to talk about today. The vouchers, as I described, are usually tenant-based vouchers, right? They stick to the resident. If I get a voucher from the housing authority, I search around my neighborhood, my city, my town, and identify a landlord whose rent is within the voucher value range and who's going to pass quality inspections. And then I can use that voucher to help pay my rent in that unit. But vouchers can also be project-based. That is, housing authorities can decide to stick vouchers onto units, including assisted living community units, to cover the shelter costs of those units. And so if it's a market rate independent living with no services, that independent living community could work with the housing authority to get project-based vouchers stuck to a number of those units and provide that deep rental subsidy for those number of units. But an assisted living community can do the same, work with their local public housing authority to commit a certain number of units over a certain number of years to that assisted living community. And what it does is it provides affordability for those residents who are in those units, because they're only going to be paying that 30% of their household income, and the housing authority pays the rest of the rent. And it allows assisted living communities to get that steady rental income from the voucher program while serving that extremely low income population. to get to work with a housing authority, a few things, we know a few things about these contracts that I wanted to share. And so housing authorities can enter into contracts with assisted living communities to project base vouchers to assisted living units. Those contracts can be for 1 year, they can be up to 20 years with a possibility for renewal. The contracts would typically describe what the initial rents are for the units, and then either how that contract and those rents get renegotiated or reset every year, and clarify the responsibilities of the public housing authority and the assisted living owner. Because there's a scarce number of vouchers, right? Because we don't have enough housing subsidy to meet everyone's needs. We need to make sure that the people using the vouchers meet the income eligibility guidelines. And so every year, people's incomes have to get recertified. Of course, we want to make sure as taxpayers that the vouchers are getting used in places that meet certain housing quality standards. And so the units get inspected before move-in and then regularly thereafter. And then, as I mentioned, how those rent adjustments are going to happen. And I'll pause there because that's a really big part of this, obviously, is if you have an amount of rent that the voucher will cover, that's one thing, right? Because HUD has decided how much the rent is in Spokane, Washington. But if you're an assisted living provider in Spokane, there's probably some work that needs to be happened, probably by a consultant or someone who's done something very similar, really near where and around the same time you're trying to do it, to figure out of your assisted living costs, what are the shelter costs? Like, how do you tell the housing authority of all of the costs to be an assisted living resident in our community? These are the shelter costs, and this is how we know they're, within the cap of your the value of the voucher that the public housing authority has set. And so that's going to be an important part of this, is understanding what the rent share, what the shelter share of your assisted living costs are. And as you can imagine, that's because HUD is in the housing business, and HUD is not interested in paying for assisted living services and really anything outside of what they consider shelter rent. So let's say, if a housing authority decides that it will project-based vouchers into assisted living, it can't just say, ABC Assisted Living, we're going to work with you and do this. They have to put it out basically for a RFP and say, the Public Housing Authority of Spokane has decided it will project base X% of its vouchers in assisted living. Who would like to participate in that? And it might hear from various assisted living providers, or it might just hear from that one, you. And then you'll be able to reap the benefits of getting these vouchers into your communities. A couple of cool things here is that PHAs, and I'm sorry for that capital S and that acronym on the slide, PHAs, public housing authorities, can, for project-based vouchers, because you have specific, not just anyone needs to live in an assisted living, right? And so, you can set, has to have ADLs over this many, et cetera. So you can set special preferences to make sure to the people who are moving into your assisted living in a unit that has a project-based voucher, and it really needs those assisted living services. And that is obviously going to be really important, right, as a qualifier to move into your unit. So all those things are possible when you start working with a public housing authority on getting some of their units into assisted living. Housing authorities have a cap for the number of their vouchers that they can project base. And this gets back to the fact that they are project basing a share of their tenant-based vouchers. And the whole point of the voucher program has always been and will always continue to be providing choice to tenants, to households who are using the vouchers, so that people can live in neighborhoods of their choosing, right? Near the schools they want to live near the services, near the grocery store, near their relatives, etc. And so Congress always gets nervous when you start taking away that choice, but so they've limited the number of vouchers that a housing authority can get project-based, except, you'll see this is at the bottom of the slide underlined, if the buildings where those project-based vouchers are, they have exceptions for certain types of buildings, where those buildings are exclusively for older adults, or where those households are eligible for supportive services that are going to be provided in those communities, like assisted living. And so while the Public Housing Authority does have a cap on the number of its vouchers that can be project-based in any one unit, that cap disappears under these exceptions for older adults and for buildings that have these supportive services built into them. So more good news for assisted living providers. And I'll stop there, and I just want to say, I've been talking about assisted living. None of this is true for nursing homes, right? And we know that assisted living is defined differently in different states, but for nursing homes, HUD has a flat out prohibition on using vouchers to pay the shelter costs in nursing homes. So if anyone's thinking, oh, I wonder if we could get this to work in nursing homes, the answer is no. But for assisted living, it's still game on. So I wanted to give you a sense of what the value of a voucher looks like. And we've reviewed that HUD annually establishes fair market rents. The housing authority can then set the value of the voucher somewhere between 90 and 110% of fair market rents. And they can go above that to serve people with disabilities if they want to. And fair market rents are set by location and by size. So I listed 4 zip codes here. DC uses zip codes to define their fair market rents, and instead of a large metropolitan statistical area, but you can see that the amount that a voucher, the amount of rent that a voucher would cover is probably right around where you would hope it would be, right? And so and I'm not sure where these neighborhoods are in DC, but 1,500 to 2,300 for an efficiency in DC. You can see 2,300 for an efficiency, or 2,000 range being reasonable, right? And so for living in a market rate unit, and so DC and HUD have tried really hard the last couple of years to keep up the value of their vouchers with rapidly increasing private market rents, which bodes well for assisted living communities who are looking to cover a share of their costs to residents with these vouchers. So you're going to sort of the steps to this, right? When you approach and start talking with your housing authority, there are certain things that are of like, why is this valuable to an assisted living provider? And I think I have a slide on why is this valuable to the Public Housing Authority? Like, what do they get out of it? So for a project-based voucher for an assisted living provider, you get these vouchers, and I have one example here from a member in Washington State where they have a 180-bed assisted living community. They worked with their local housing authority to get project-based vouchers for 145 of those units. And now they're seeing monthly revenue of $67,000 a month into the assisted living community from the Public Housing Authority to cover the voucher, the shelter part of those residents' costs. Let me just go back up here because I don't think I have a slide here on the value of the Public Housing Authority, sort of when you're trying to make the case to your Public Housing Authority of why project-based vouchers for assisted living, why work with us. A couple of things stand out. The first is that public housing authorities generally, like all communities, have aging residents. And they have residents aging with and with new needs, new service needs, new healthcare needs that the public housing authority can't meet. And I believe that many of them are extremely interested in figuring out a way that they have a pipeline to move residents out of their independent living when it's necessary, when people choose to, and into a place like assisted living. And so it might be in their best interest to have a trusted provider partner that provides assisted living for their residents to go when the affordable housing community can't meet all of their needs on their own. The other reason is that housing authorities are driven by getting their vouchers used, right? There's a scarcity of affordable housing assistance, right? There's much more need than we have. And so Congress and HUD put a lot of pressure on public housing authorities, not just to give vouchers to residents, give vouchers to people on the waiting list and say, good luck finding a place to go live with these vouchers, but to actually getting those vouchers under lease. And so HUD measures the lease up rate of public housing authorities vouchers very, very carefully. And for the next fiscal year, the Public Housing Authority's voucher budget is based on the lease up rate of this year's vouchers. And so housing authorities are financially incentivized to get their voucher lease up rates up as high as possible so they can continue to get the voucher budgets they want to run their overall programs.
Linda, looks like we already have a question in the chat. Hearing from Donna Kasner, she's asking if the VA, or I'm assuming Veteran Affairs, aid and attendance benefits are considered income for purposes of calculating that 30% of income.
Yes, I believe that they are. Yep.
Thank you.
Yep. HUD's pretty strict about income. There are a couple of income exclusions, but by and large, Social Security, VA benefits, any kind of pension, they're going to count toward your income. So, and every public housing authority, for every calendar year, 75% of the vouchers they issue that calendar year must go to extremely low income households. The remaining 50 can go to households with incomes up to 50% of area median. So, understanding where your area median is and where people fit is another thing that's really important. It's something else that your public housing authority should be able to describe to you really quickly, right? Instead of you going and looking up the median income charts and figuring out where you fit, right? Having conversations with your public housing authority, really to see where partnerships are, including a partnership around project-based vouchers for assisted living. So it's a HUD program. There's lots of fine print. There's lots of details. So this is a really broad brush about how you could use project-based vouchers in assisted living. Housing authorities have to come up with, every year they have an administrative plan that they have to develop and publish, and they update it every year. And in that administrative plan, they have to declare if they're going to project base any of their vouchers and if they're going to target any kind of populations with those project-based vouchers. HUD doesn't approve those plans, but they are official policy. And so that's the first step, is to, when you're talking with your public housing authority, to see if they already have project-based vouchers anywhere, and then to go from there to see if it's something that you could work with them to include in their administrative plan, so that eventually you can be a partner with them and receive some of those vouchers. This is an awkward mashup of screenshots of a HUD notice that says, we'll let you use vouchers in assisted living, but not in nursing homes. So you've never worked with your public housing authority. Chances are, if your housing authority is, a medium to small size, which the vast majority of them are, you'll be able to reach out to the administrator or director of your public housing authority's voucher program. If they're all but the smallest ones, they'll have someone who oversees the public housing side of their operation, and then someone who oversees the voucher side of their operation. If it's a really small housing authority, you might be able to reach out to the executive director directly. I'll note too that I think I've usually used the term public housing authority. They're also called public housing agencies. Some cities have moved away from using anything that has to do with the acronym PHA, right? Portland, Oregon calls their public housing authority Home Forward. You know, some cities have very different terms now for what they call their local public housing authority, but it's the quasi-government organization that administers public housing and vouchers. So you reach out and ask them, right, do you project base any of your vouchers? And then start to talk to them. Are you at your limit? What about project basing into assisted living, right? We've got a lot of extremely low income residents who are really struggling to pay for their assisted living. You know, it'd be great to work with you to establish a project-based voucher protocol for some of the housing authorities vouchers. And this is what it could do for our extremely low income residents and for residents coming from your public housing authority pipeline, and of course, for the broader community. Oh, so here's my slide. Look, I totally got ahead of myself. So this is why public housing authorities should really want to be interested in using vouchers in assisted living, right? Oh, and I even forgot one thing to mention. This is another good thing. So vouchers are really hard for people to use. If I got a voucher today and went through DC and tried to find a unit that was in a pretty decent neighborhood that's going to pass the housing quality standards, and that's within the value of the voucher cap, I'm going to have a hard time when, you know, push comes to shove to lease up that voucher, because there's a scarcity of housing and there's a scarcity of units that are going to meet all of those criteria. And so rental markets are hot, and housing authorities generally are having HUD's really trying to keep up with those values, but they're not always quite there. So housing authorities really can be struggling to lease up their vouchers, which again is in their best financial interest to lease up as many vouchers as possible, because next year's voucher funding relies on this year's lease up numbers. I want to say a word. So we talked about public housing, and there's fine print and there's rules, and they have a limit on how many overall vouchers they can project base and how many vouchers they can project base in any one building. They have value of the voucher designations. They have all these different, you know, compliance, the administrative plan that they have to comply with to project-based vouchers and get take a different path and using that as tenant-based or housing choice vouchers. I wanted to highlight this map, and this is not a geographically accurate map. HUD's this is from a HUD page, but I wanted to highlight this fact that each of these dots represents a public housing authority that is what is in HUD's world called a moving to work agency. And if you're a moving to work public housing agency, you get a pass on the vast majority of HUD's rules and regulations, really from most everything that isn't like a civil rights problem. So the share of your units that you project base, the number of units that can get project based in any one building, the value of the voucher, the process through which you project base with all assisted living providers or one or two of them. The public housing authorities that are moving to work agencies just have a tremendous amount more flexibility with working in a pretty creative program like this one is. And so if you can use these these websites here that I put on to see if your local housing authority happens to be one of these moving to work agencies. In my sense, my understanding from talking to our, the few of our members who've done this, working with their moving to work public housing authorities is just a lot easier than working with a non-moving to work public housing authority, but both are definitely possible. So with moving to work PHAs, the paperwork can be less, the process can be much more streamlined. We had a member who the housing authority and the assisted living provider didn't have to do any calculation of someone's income eligibility or figuring out what their rents would be, their shelter costs of their assisted living, because the housing authority could just use someone's Medicaid participation to prove that they were eligible for the voucher and decide on their own what the shelter portion would be. We have one assisted living member, and this is really a little bit like the fox watching the hen house, but the assisted living provider is doing their own inspections of their own units instead of the public housing authority doing it. And if it wasn't such a great provider of ours, I'd be a little suspicious of that, but I don't feel particularly worried about that in this case. But just to show you that there's a lot of flexibility there for these moving to work public housing authorities. All right, and so that is my presentation, Ashley, and I should have also thanked Kimberly with Lutheran Services in America. I really appreciate you all highlighting this resource. And we don't think a lot of LeadingAge members are using it, but it is out there, it's legal, and if you can work with your housing authority to get it to work for your assisted living community, I guarantee it will benefit your bottom line, it'll benefit your lowest income residents, and it'll benefit the community at large over the years.
Great, thank you so much, Linda. We're now at our Q&A portion of the webinar, so feel free to come off mute or to also type in the chat box if you have any questions. I did receive one question while you were speaking, Linda, and that was you mentioned a little bit about the quality inspections, which a number of our members are familiar with. Can you shed light on what the process of quality inspections or what that looks like?
So HUD does what's called housing quality inspections, and actually for the first time in 35 years, HUD is revamping. It's our 40 years. HUD is revamping its quality inspections and rolling out a whole new protocol for all of its housing platforms this summer. But it's like, the housing authority is required to go to the unit before it agrees to pay you rent for that unit to make sure that, there are no fire code violations, that the utilities work, that there's plumbing, that the door's locked, that there's a smoke alarm, depending on where you are, if you have carbon monoxide laws, etc. And so it is an effort, and actually the voucher program is credited with really improving housing quality standards in the United States. That was one of the reasons it was created in 1974, because a lot of people were living in slum housing, and they decided if they had a government program, one of the things they're absolutely going to do is have housing quality standards to increase the quality of housing. But you do have to work with your housing authority. It has to get inspected, and yep.
Great, thank you.
I see a question here from Donna about do shelter costs include utilities? Yes, shelter costs include utilities, so heat, hot water, electricity, utilities that you can think of. They do not include internet, much to our chagrin, but all other utilities, yes, housing costs do. So if someone's paying 30% of their income on their housing costs, that includes whatever utility costs they have to cover when they pay their rent, or if they pay, if it's separately metered, which I doubt assisted living communities have separately metered utilities, but private market owners have to figure that out too. Yep. I think when we were coming up with this, we I think Kimberly, you asked me like, what's the first thing? I think the first thing to do is to go on the HUD website and figure out who your local public housing authority is. And see if you know anyone who works there. And, you can, try to get in that way. These are, generally people who have a lot of work to do and not a lot of time to do it. So I would be patient. They are quasi-public organizations, and depending on your state and how it chartered public housing authorities, they have boards of directors that could be appointed by your town or your county or maybe your state, but they do have boards that they're responsible to that are publicly appointed, and they control a ton of federal housing resources, particularly, and I would say the majority of federal housing resources that are going to the lowest income households. And so partnering with them, even if you can't get the project-based voucher idea to work right off, figuring out how to partner with them. Maybe there are some services programs you can enter into them just so they get to know you and you know them. There's also a lot of new jargon, right? If you come from the assisted living world, there's new language and new acronyms. I totally get it on the housing side, that you might not be used to. Just even talking about area median incomes, right? Housing programs don't use the federal poverty standard to determine eligibility for programs. When we talk about affordable housing, we're using the federal standard for affordable housing, which is someone paying no more than 30% of their housing for their housing costs. And as Donna said, that's a great question about the utilities. Does the state process layer with Medicaid? Absolutely. So if Medicaid is in paying for the services side and you've got HUD in there and your public housing authority paying for the voucher side, what a great situation for someone who would otherwise not have the resources to live in assisted living. So yes, definitely Medicaid can be there sort of hand in hand partnering with a project-based voucher program.
Linda, just to toot the horn of our members, we actually had Carla Wilton, who's the COO at Emmanuel Lutheran Communities in Kalispell, Montana, recently testify to Congress about the Veterans Affairs Housing Choice Program expanding to assisted living communities. So I'm not sure, has there been any similarities or complementary of HUD looking at their voucher program alongside the VA's voucher program?
That's interesting, Ashley. Just a couple of weeks ago, I was at the National Coalition for Homeless Veterans Conference and learned a lot about what the VA is doing for older adults right now, for homeless older adults, but also older adults who aren't experiencing homelessness. And the VA is ahead of HUD on most of these markers, right? Like we're here trying to educate as many people possible about this opportunity with project-based vouchers and getting assisted living providers and others to take advantage of this. The VA has programs that are coming from the top down to get more assisted living type services to veterans, to get more home and community-based services to veterans, to figure out a way to really have a continuum of aging services. As you said, the Veterans Affairs, there's a voucher program called VASH, which is Veterans Affairs Supportive Housing. And those vouchers too go to your public housing authority, and they're required to work with their local VA medical center, who together they work with the homeless services system and to help people who are experiencing homelessness, who are veterans, find housing. And it's all about preventing homelessness and ending homelessness among veterans. But actually, that's a great kind of connection to this program, because I could see your assisted living providers having I'm sure many of you do serve a lot of veterans, but having a proactive role in where those VASH vouchers can be used, right? Leased up, right? Because it's about finding landlords and providers who will take these vouchers and say, yeah, we want these vouchers. We want to serve low income people with the greatest needs. We've got a mission to meet. Let's go. And so working with your public housing authority to say, do you have VASH vouchers? Do you have PB, project-based vouchers? We want to be your partner.
Great. Thank you so much, Linda. Any other questions for Linda? I think we've typed in the chat, but do we have any network members on the call or anyone willing to come off mute who have already had success in partnering with their public housing authority, whether that be in the assisted living space and project-based vouchers or other types of partnership? And could you share a little bit about that experience?
And I'll just say too, you could start small. You could say, give us 3 vouchers. Let's set aside 3 project-based vouchers next year and let's see how it goes. Your housing authority might be more comfortable with that. You could, you could say, let's start with 100, but you could start small too for yourself and for the public housing authority to see how it goes. What's the waiting list process? How does that really work? Because it's, I'm sure, very different than waiting list processes and assisted living. What does that mean to get an inspection? What does that mean to make sure that someone's income is in the right space? And you can start really small here and see how this could level up really really quickly if it works out for you and works out for your bottom line, right? You're not interested in losing money here, and so that key piece of figuring out what the rental portion, what the shelter costs are of your assisted living is tricky, and it's got to be defensible, right? You've got to present it to the housing authority in a way that they're gonna that they can document that they're not overpaying or to try to find that sweet spot.
Linda, one thing we found so powerful in our nationwide network is being able to connect peers who are going through the same challenges. I'm wondering if you possibly have a list, or if we have individuals who do reach out who are interested in being connected to perhaps someone in their state who has secured these vouchers, if that's something that we might be able to offer to folks on this call.
I wish I had a list. I have a list of
A growing list.
5 providers who are doing this.
Wow.
And I have a list about 5,000 who are like, wow, this is great. I wish we could do this where I am. And so if you reach out to me, Ashley or Kimberly, I'm happy to share with you some or email connect people. But because the people who are doing this are they're ready to proselytize, right? They want to spread the word and share. So yep.
What do you think is the reason in which there's so few assisted living communities? Is it that the awareness or being able to do it, or
I think it's awareness, but honestly I think there's a lot of hesitancy from doing just about anything with your local public housing authority. I think public housing in general, even without the word authority or agency after it, doesn't have a good reputation in this country, where these are organizations with large staffs, with committed people, with resources we all need. And so, working with your public housing authority is a bridge that, it serves us well to make. And so I think that's a lot of I think it's awareness that it can be done at all. And there might even, and I'm sure there's awareness, not just on the assisted living side, the aging services side, but also on the public housing side. Right. And so showing them the HUD notice that said, yeah, you can do this, really. Right. So I think there's awareness on both sides, because I do know that, the older adults in public housing, and probably a lot of you are familiar with HUD's Section 202 program, which is HUD's flagship senior housing program. Groups like Lutheran Services in America own those buildings, run them, manage them, as well as lots of other nonprofits. But compared to, and that's what we call multifamily housing, right, where there's a private owner that has a contract with HUD to provide that affordable housing. Older adults living in public housing compared to older adults living in multifamily housing are older. They have more chronic conditions. They're less likely to be white, and they have lower incomes than the very, the HUD multifamily providers serve a very old and very poor population, there's no doubt. But when you compare to public housing, just those demographics are just a little bit different. So it behooves public housing to get on this track with us.
Actually, Linda, that's a really interesting question that I was going to ask, and really drawing on your expertise in the affordable housing industry. Would there be any advantage to our members who are, providing affordable housing, this multifamily, they often have, sometimes that's their only property, but often they have several different kinds of properties, skilled nursing, independent living, assisted living. Do you think there would be any advantages to them, or would the process be easier because they're already working with HUD? Or
I think that it would be easier just because they would know more of the language, right? They would
Yeah.
understand more waiting lists and income certifications and
Yeah.
income exclusions, and everyone has to comply in the whole United States with fair housing, but for HUD and federal affordable housing providers, the fair housing laws are a lot, they're piled on, and they're a lot more. And then when you talk about, and so I think, if you have any kind of an affordable housing program, and you also have assisted living, you're several steps ahead here because you're sort of in the language. But I wouldn't, it doesn't mean you shouldn't get involved if you're
Oh, no, of course not. Of course not. But, if we can share the information in a way that helps members understand, you might already be a third of the way down the road because of your experience. It seems perhaps it might seem a little less of a process. So
a little less daunting.
Great. Thank you.
Well, I think if we don't have any further questions, I want to thank you so much, Linda, for joining us and sharing your insight and knowledge with this terrific opportunity for our members. For folks who haven't joined a Strength and Service webinar session before, you'll receive a follow-up email from my colleague Kim Roque containing materials from the webinar as well as a link to the recording. So please stay tuned for that. I also want to call your attention to our next Strength and Service webinar series, which is Structuring Competitive Executive Compensation for Lutheran Services in America Leaders, which will be hosted by Portico Benefit Services in Cape and Krause. And that will be on Wednesday, June 28th at 1 p.m. Eastern, next Wednesday. So thank you all so much for joining us, and we hope you have a wonderful week. Bye now.